They were not kings, nor generals, nor politicians, yet they built empires that outlived them all. Their weapons were not swords or cannons, but signatures and seals. While nations fought on the battlefield, these men conquered from behind mahogany desks and marble halls. They were the silent architects of the modern world, the ones who learned that power did not lie in governments, but in who financed them. From the ashes of revolutions and the ruins of wars, they built an invisible empire, an empire of credit, interest, and perpetual debt. It began centuries ago, when monarchs realized that wars cost more than loyalty could pay. Gold was finite, but ambition was not. So they turned to those who could conjure wealth from promises, the early bankers. Families like the Medici, the Fuggers, and later the Rothschilds mastered a new kind of alchemy, transforming paper into power. They financed kings, armed revolutions, and charged interest on history itself. They discovered the truth that still governs the world today, that money can be created not by labor, but by agreement. From the palaces of Europe to the counting houses of London, banking became a tool of statecraft. No decision, no war, no treaty could move without their approval. Nations no longer rose through conquest, but through credit. The banker's pen replaced the general's sword. When the Rothschilds funded both sides of the Napoleonic Wars, it was not treason, it was business. And when Napoleon fell, the bankers emerged richer than any crown. They had created a world where even victory came with interest. As the 19th century dawned, their influence spread across continents. The Rothschilds became the lifeblood of European finance. The Barings, the Morgans, and the Warburgs followed, weaving a global network of capital that transcended borders. It was a quiet empire. No flags, no armies, just contracts and bonds. They built railways, industries, and governments, and in return, demanded obedience. Money flowed where they willed it. Nations that cooperated prospered. Those that resisted collapsed. When the United States emerged from its Civil War, it was already in the hands of this invisible power. J.P. Morgan rose as America's new financial titan, controlling not just banks, but industries and even the U.S. Treasury itself. He bailed out the government during financial crises, not as a citizen, but as a lender. A private man became more powerful than the state. Behind the illusion of democracy, the true architects of policy were those who held the debt. Governments changed. The debt remained. These bankers saw the world not as nations, but as markets. They thought in generations, not elections. They funded wars, reconstructed economies, and quietly rewrote the meaning of sovereignty. A country that owes is a country that obeys, and every loan was a leash. While politicians debated and citizens dreamed of freedom, the bankers were designing the next century. Their influence was not loud, but absolute. Their names rarely appeared in history books, yet every page was written by their hands. With the dawn of central banking, their reach became institutional. The Bank of England became the model, blending government authority with private profit. Control of currency meant control of destiny. And soon, other nations followed. France, Germany, and eventually America adopted similar systems. What had begun as private fortune had evolved into global governance through finance. Money itself was no longer a public utility. It was a product owned, issued, and managed by the few. The bankers learned that to truly rule, one must not appear to rule. They moved behind curtains, influencing policy through advisors, donations, and debt. Presidents and prime ministers were temporary. The flow of money was eternal. When they spoke, markets moved. When they withdrew, nations trembled. They did not need armies. Their control of credit was enough to shape the fate of millions. The age of empires was over. The age of finance had begun. As revolutions shook Europe and the industrial age rose, these financial dynasties expanded their control. They funded factories, railroads, and governments alike, both the builders and the destroyers. To them, war was not tragedy. It was investment. Every reconstruction brought profit. Every crisis was an opportunity to lend. The rhythm of progress itself became synchronized to the tempo of their interest rates. Humanity was building its future with borrowed money. and they held the bill. And by the turn of the 20th century, they had achieved what kings had only dreamed of: dominion over the world without conquest. They didn't need to seize land, they could seize economies. They didn't need to declare rule. Their power was embedded in every transaction, every coin, every note. The modern world, with its governments, central banks, and global markets, was not a natural evolution. It was designed, brick by brick, by those who understood one timeless truth: if you control the money, you control the world. The great secret of power was never in politics, it was in finance. Behind every parliament, every war room, every revolution, there was always a banker calculating risk and reward. The world's destiny was written not in constitutions, but in contracts. The men who mastered the flow of credit became the hidden sovereigns of civilization. They learned to influence history not by force, but by liquidity. The world obeyed the man who could provide, or deny, the loan. When the First World War erupted, it wasn't just nations that went to battle. It was banking systems. Empires borrowed billions from private financiers to feed their war machines. The Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Warburgs, and others turned chaos into opportunity. As soldiers bled on the front lines, the balance sheets of banks swelled. The victors paid with victory bonds. The defeated paid with reparations. In the end, everyone owed someone, and those someones were always the same. Out of the ashes of war came a new world, one that needed reconstruction, and reconstruction meant credit. The United States emerged as the new financial capital, and with it came the dominance of Wall Street. J.P. Morgan's legacy evolved into a network of influence that spanned oceans. Loans to Europe rebuilt cities but enslaved economies. The bankers who had once financed kings now financed nations, governments, and global institutions. Sovereignty had become collateral. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was the bankers' greatest triumph, a system that institutionalized private control over public money. No longer did governments have to beg for gold, they simply borrowed paper. The illusion of independence was complete. While politicians spoke of democracy and freedom, monetary policy was dictated by unelected men in closed rooms. The people voted for leaders, but it was the bankers who wrote the rules of the game. By the time the Great Depression struck, the system had matured into a machine of manipulation. Panic, boom, collapse. Each phase predictable, each profitable to those who understood it. As millions starved, a handful grew richer than ever. Banks failed by design, assets were consolidated, and entire markets were devoured. It was the perfect cycle. Crisis leads to consolidation, and consolidation leads to control. The few always emerged stronger, while the masses paid in suffering. World War II expanded this control to the entire planet. Financing both allies and reconstruction gave rise to institutions that would shape the next century. The World Bank, the IMF, the BIS. They were presented as tools of stability, but behind their polished facades lay the same philosophy: control through debt. Developing nations were offered loans, not freedom. Their infrastructure was financed, their futures mortgaged. It was the old system in a new disguise, colonialism rebranded as economics. By mid-century, the balance of power was no longer measured in territory or gold, but in influence over money itself. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency, and the U.S. Federal Reserve became the heart of global finance. The same private networks that once funded monarchs now directed the monetary bloodstream of humanity. Every trade, every nation, every dream ran through their veins. The bankers had become the new architects of order. They learned to move unseen, through corporate boards, think tanks, and global forums. Their empires were no longer built on family names, but on faceless institutions with trillion-dollar balance sheets. BlackRock, Vanguard, and similar giants carried the torch of their ancestors. Ownership became decentralized in name only. The same small elite held the strings. The modern economy was no longer a system of production, but of control. The irony is that the bankers never forced the world to obey. The world volunteered. Politicians traded autonomy for funding. Corporations traded ethics for liquidity. Citizens traded freedom for convenience. And in this silent agreement, the illusion was complete. Money, once a symbol of trust, became a tool of domination. The invisible empire no longer needed secrecy because its power had become normal. But every empire, visible or not, eventually meets its reckoning. As digital currencies rise and new financial powers emerge, the old guard faces its greatest challenge yet. The question is not whether their reign will end, but how much of humanity's freedom will vanish with it. The story of the bankers who created nations is far from over. It is merely evolving into the next chapter of control. As the 20th century gave way to the digital age, the empire of the bankers evolved once again. No longer bound by vaults or borders, they moved their influence into cyberspace. The same principles remained: control the flow of money, and you control the world. But now the battlefield was invisible. Currency became data, and banks became networks. Power no longer needed gold or paper. It existed in algorithms and encrypted ledgers. The institutions that once conquered nations through debt now ruled them through systems. The global financial order, carefully constructed over centuries, had reached a point of perfection. Markets were interconnected, currencies floated freely, and the illusion of prosperity was sustained by endless liquidity. The same few institutions managed trillions, not through ownership of things, but ownership of influence. Every major bank, corporation, and government was entangled in the same web of credit. It was a system so vast, so efficient, that it no longer needed coercion. Compliance had become automatic, but beneath the surface, the same old mechanisms endured. Nations were still trapped in cycles of borrowing and repayment. The same international banks that financed development projects dictated the policies that governed them. Aid came with conditions, and loans came with invisible chains. The bankers had mastered a new kind of empire, one without armies, where control was measured not in territory, but in dependency. Sovereignty had become a story people told themselves to feel free. When crises erupted, whether financial, political, or environmental, the same pattern followed. Panic would spread, governments would seek rescue, and the bankers would step in. Central banks flooded markets with new money, stabilizing the system they themselves had destabilized. Every crash became a reset, every recovery a deeper form of control. The financial elite no longer feared collapse. It was their tool. The cycle of crisis and bailout had replaced the old cycle of war and peace. The digital revolution gave them new weapons. With the rise of online banking, stock algorithms, and digital payments, money became traceable, programmable, and controllable. The idea of privacy, once sacred, faded into myth. Financial surveillance became the backbone of governance. The same forces that had once built nations were now engineering behavior. People were no longer just consumers of goods, they were products in the data economy. The bankers' empire had merged with the algorithmic state. Then came the dawn of cryptocurrencies, the rebellion against the system they built. It promised liberation, decentralization, and a world beyond their reach. For a moment, it seemed that control might finally shatter. But the old masters watched and adapted. They invested, regulated, and infiltrated. What began as revolution slowly became assimilation. The technology that could have freed humanity was redirected to strengthen the cage. The illusion of freedom returned, this time on a blockchain. Behind every innovation, the same question remained: who funds it? Behind every promise of progress, the same answer whispered: the bankers. They no longer needed to manipulate from the shadows. They had become the architects of the digital age itself. Artificial intelligence, fintech, global markets, all moved in concert, guided by capital that flowed through invisible hands. They had achieved what their ancestors only dreamed of, a system that could perpetuate itself indefinitely. But even the perfect system has a flaw: belief. Every financial empire, from Rome to Wall Street, survives only as long as people believe in it. Once that faith falters, the illusion collapses. The bankers who created nations knew this truth well. That's why they worked tirelessly to maintain confidence, to keep the public distracted, to turn complexity into confusion. For them, ignorance was not a failure. It was strategy. And yet, as history has shown, illusions cannot endure forever. The system that built the modern world stands at the edge of its own contradiction. It has consumed more than it can sustain, promised more than it can deliver. The age of infinite debt is reaching its limit. The question now is not whether it will end, but what will rise from its ashes. Will humanity reclaim its freedom, or will the next empire, digital, cashless, total, seal its fate forever? The bankers who created nations will one day fade, as all empires do. But their legacy will remain, in every dollar printed, every system coded, every promise made. They were not simply financiers, they were the architects of belief. They proved that nations are not built with stone or blood, but with trust, and that trust, once commodified, can build worlds or destroy them. The world they built still stands, vast, intricate, fragile, waiting for the moment when someone finally dares to pull the plug.